there is possibly nothing more intimidating on the face of the earth than for a human to stand right in front of a hungry, angry, roaring lion. If my presence here was replaced, I don't think you would be sitting there looking like you are just now. Those of you who know the story of David Livingstone, the 19th century godly explorer of the continent of Africa, you may recall that occasion in his life when he was attacked by an angry lion, and that powerful beast that jumped at him, and the jaws connected with Livingstone's left shoulder and crushed the bone and left these gaping gashes. Well, thankfully, with the help of others around him, he survived that encounter. If you don't know his story, it's an incentive to read it. Hopefully, most of us will never have to face, literally, a roaring lion. However, if you are a child of God, you have to have dealings with your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Peter tells us that in 1 Peter chapter 5. You see, what we have to face as Christians is in that sense no different to Livingstone. But more particularly as we come to Daniel chapter 6 this morning, to face in that sense is no different to what Daniel had to face. This morning we're considering what I've simply called overcoming lions. We're coming to what probably would be, surely, the best known story in the book of Daniel. And as was said before, I'm sure it's probably one of the, if not the, favourite Bible story that children love to hear. No matter how many times you've heard the story, you love to hear it again. Daniel in the lion's den. Well, Daniel chapter 6, the time in Daniel's life when he's now an older man, he's in his 80s, he's possibly even 85 years old. And all through his life, remember, he has stood for God. We saw in our first study in chapter 1, in his teenage years, early in life, when all the pressures were upon him, otherwise Daniel, the young person, would not compromise. And then over the decades, though living and working in a pagan context, by the grace of God, Daniel maintained a faithful witness right in the very heart of the headquarters of the Babylonian Empire. We saw last week, Daniel maintained his faithful testimony right to the very last night, right to the very last hours of the Babylonian Empire, right up until it fell. In today's study, we come face to face with Daniel, and we see him as a man of faith. We see effectively how the grace of God at work in an ordinary man can create a resolute faith in the face of lions. In this, which is the last narrative story in the book of this is taken up with various prophecies, Daniel shows us how to face lions. Not just the big cats in a cave or in a den, but pagan men of the world who hate us for Christ's sake and are out to devour us. As well as he shows us how we are to face the roaring lion that Peter speaks about in 1 Peter 5 that I quoted before, that very enemy of our souls. Well, as the story opens in chapter 6 here, it opens with a change of dynasty. The Babylonian Empire is now a thing of the past. It's relegated to the history where we read about it today. Babylon has been conquered by the combined might of the Mede and Persians. And the new ruler was actually introduced to us in the last verse of chapter 5, where it says, and I will call him Darius, though there's no competition happening here, that's going to come out of my mouth. Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years of age. Now, when we put the historical jigsaw together, we find that Darius reigned only a short time. Cyrus the Persian would be reigning. And he's actually mentioned in the last verse of chapter 6. That's the Cyrus who's mentioned elsewhere in the Scriptures. He's mentioned in Isaiah, he's prophesied to come. Cyrus the Great, sometimes he's called. He's mentioned in the time of he's the very one who sponsors and directs the Lord's people to leave Babylon and to go back to settle again in the Promised Land. But where we are in this story is not quite there. We're with Darius. And it's fallen to him this difficult task of trying to take over the Babylonian Empire, new direction, give it, if you like, a new identity under the rule of the Medes and Persians. The administrative difficulties before that man must have been immense. We see how he goes about it in the first few verses, politically, what his strategy is. It says, Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. And over these, 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give an account to them so that the king would suffer no loss. That shows us how Darius sought to tackle this awesome task that he had. He puts in place this system of 120 men, and most likely those men each had an area of responsibility throughout the kingdom. And then those 120 satraps, as they're called, are answerable to 3 presidents or 3 governors, as the translation here puts it. And those were in turn answerable to the monarch, answerable to the king, Darius. It didn't take too long for one of those governors, to stand out. Verse 3 tells us, then this Daniel distinguished himself above the satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. That then, if you like, is the setting as we come to the first 3 things that we'll look at this morning. We'll look at Daniel's destruction, Daniel's decision, and then Daniel's deliverance. Let's think about Daniel's destruction. At the end of verse 3, it says, the king gave thought to setting him, that is, setting Daniel, the one who has distinguished himself above all others, of setting him over the whole realm. Here's the king, beginning in his mind to formulate a new plan. In our language today, we would say he is considering implementing some reforms. That's what they call it today, reforms. He's thinking about putting into place some plans of restructuring the government's higher management. And this restructuring would mean that he would create a new position in higher management of a chief executive officer. That's what we would call it today, wouldn't we? A CEO, a chief executive officer. And the reason that Darius was thinking this way was because Daniel had caught his eye. He wanted to run the whole show. In his judgment, this guy was the guy he wanted in charge. And obviously it didn't take too long for Darius to work out that Daniel was an honest man of integrity, that he was a man endowed with much wisdom, that he was a capable manager, and that he was a man with immense experience in leadership in governmental areas in the past. You see, he was just the man that Darius needed at such a crucial time as he's involved in setting up this new empire. And yet when thoughts of the king, as we would say today, begin to leak out to the other government officials, they were not so keen about this talk of restructuring their government department. It didn't go down too well with the union of what was being spoken about, or what was being cooked up and planned in the head of the king. So we see that Darius was planning a promotion for Daniel, and the other government officials, as we see in a moment, were planning his destruction or his demise. We see that in verse 4. So, king's got the plan. So, the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom. But they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful. Nor was there any error or fault found in him. So as Daniel, if you like, is being groomed to become the CEO or the Prime Minister, perhaps is the political term we would use. He's being groomed to become the Prime Minister of the empire. Here are these men, they're looking for ways to discredit him. Seems to me that not much has changed in the political realm. That's what happens today. Here are these men, they're looking for some mud to fling. They're looking for some dirty linen in the past that they could air about Daniel. They're looking and they're searching in Daniel's cupboard. They want to find some skeleton in the past. They want to hear his reputation and stop his promotion. That's their desire. But they couldn't find anything to nail on him. The verse says they could find no charge or fault in regards to his work in the kingdom. He was faithful. There's no error, there's no fault with this man. It's Daniel. Such an upright man. Why are these guys trying to destroy him? The king's made a judgment, he's the man, then why do they have a problem? Surely he would be the best man for the job and do the best for the kingdom. That would help them. Why are they against this? Why are they this man? Well, I don't think it would take too much for us to think that through to know that there's probably envy here. There's no doubt some sort of jealousy beginning to percolate inside their hearts toward why this man is getting the favourable thinking to be in that position and why they are not. You think what these men had to lose, at least some of them, especially the other two governors. Some of them would lose their power, they would lose their influence once Daniel was in that position. Daniel's known for his honesty, and perhaps these men of the world, would want to continue in their corrupt ways, but that position may obstruct them. Some of them may have actually very well been involved in the previous regime. Daniel was. There's no reason why we can't think that others weren't. And perhaps because they'd been involved in government before, they actually had developed a great network of corruption. That sort of thing happens. Daniel's elevated to Prime Minister. Surely his godliness would be a thorn in their side. You see, Daniel stood in their way in many ways for what they actually wanted on a number of levels. He stood in the way of their potential promotion and ambition. So their conclusion was, well, we've got to destroy Daniel. I believe we could say that these men hated Daniel. They hated him. You know, that shouldn't surprise us. That the men of the world would hate a godly man. Didn't Jesus say something about that? Turn with me, please, in your Bibles to John chapter 15. The very God of Daniel sends his son. He comes into the world and he says these words, 15, verse 18. If the world hates you, you know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. Yet because you are not of the world, but I chose you, I selected you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Daniel was a chosen man. Daniel was one of God's chosen ones. He was not a man of this world, and he's hated by the world. You see, in a real sense, we could say, could we not, that these men were like lions to Daniel. They stood before him, and they were ready to devour him. They were ready to consume him. They were ready to destroy him. They wanted him removed off planet Earth. They wanted him at least sidelined and out of the way. They were angry. Wanted his complete destruction. The men of this world hated Daniel. And Christians should not be shocked. We should not be offended when people of this world show their hatred toward us today as Christians. We should not be surprised when the men of this world will try to do anything to destroy us individually as Christians. We shouldn't be surprised or offended that this world and its system would do all it can to destroy Christian families. That shouldn't surprise us. It shouldn't surprise us, the men of the world. That the world system and its ways so hates Christians that it therefore will hate the Christian church. We are not of this world. Therefore the world hates us. We must remove that thinking that sometimes creeps in, and that some would even teach today, that Christians are supposed to have a life of smooth sailing through this world. No, that's not what Jesus says. Because you are not of this world, he says, but I chose you out of this world, therefore the world hates you. We must be prepared for the reality of what Jesus said would happen. That as Christians living in this world, like Daniel living in his worldly environment, face lions. People of this world who are wanting, and in some cases even planning, our failure, and if they could, our destruction. And when those plans become evident, it should not offend us, shock us, and cause us to think, oh, what do we do? Jesus has already told us this is what will happen. And yet coming back to Daniel, coming back to this story and to this man, I think it's fascinating. Isn't it interesting that these men knew that Daniel was a blameless man? And yet they seem to recognize that he was faithful to God first. They knew they couldn't find any charge about his work in the kingdom. Look at verse 5. Then these men said, we shall not fight any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. There was their only hope. But look at his religion. Haven't been able to find anything about him doing something wrong. No sniff of corruption of him at work in the kingdom. There has to be a conflict though somewhere between his God, his religion, his faithfulness and his faithfulness to the king, to the empire. There's conflict here. So they went looking for it. Well, let's analyse then now more closely what they say and what's behind their thinking, their tactics, if you like, when it comes to the planned destruction of Daniel. We follow the story from verse 6. So the governors, satraps, throng the king. So they all come before the king. They say, King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom and administrators and satraps, the councillors and advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute. We've got it worked out. We put it in front of you. We want you to sign it, is basically what they're saying. What is it? Whoever petitions any god or many days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. Now, what I want us to notice together briefly in these verses, for us to look together at it, I want us to see their lies. I want us to analyse and see not only their lies, but they use flattery to win over the king, to deceive him, in order to get the man to pick up his pen and sign the decree, which they knew once that was signed, they had him. You notice back there in verse 7, when they say to the king, they say, all the governors of the kingdom, the administrators and satraps, we've all got together and we have come up with this royal statute. Look closely at the words. All governors. But Daniel wasn't there. And we know from earlier in the passage that Daniel's one of the governors. So as they come before the king and say, all the governors have put this together, no, it's not all the governors at all. Well, that might be the majority of them, but all means all. That was a lie. That was out and out deception. They want to give the impression that the king has got an unanimous thought that comes through all of his men, and it's like pressure to put on him to sign that decree. It's a lie. And notice that drips from their words. It's like sticky honey dripping off their slimy tongues. Second half of verse 7, he says, whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Think of what they're appealing to here. Think of the flattery. For 30 days, King, people are going to treat you like a god. Think of all the attention you'll receive. Oh, the entire kingdom will be worshipping you. It's the superpower of the world. The whole world worshipping you. Maybe that worship might stick and go 31, 32, 33 days, and maybe it might last. All the eyes of the empire, the entire world will be upon you, Darius. Think of the respect you'll receive in your new position. The people will have to acknowledge that you have the answers because they're coming to you and they're not going to anyone else with their petitions. They're coming to you, which implies you've got the answers to what they ask. Think what this meant politically, how this was really flattery for them on that level. This law would unite them at such a vital time in the new empire. It will help your political cause. Everyone will be looking to you. It will be a uniting purpose. Of course, all of this flattery boosted his pride, whilst at the same time it blinded his eyes from really what was going on. You see, this was very clever deception. But friends, I want to ask the question this morning. Who was it that stood behind these evil men with their lies, flattery, and deception? Who actually was the one that stirring up these evil men with their scheme? Ultimately, who was the one who wanted Daniel's destruction? In John chapter 8 and verse 44, Jesus describes Satan as the father of lies, that he was a murderer at the beginning. You think of Satan's tactics. You think of his words that are so evident for us in Genesis chapter 3, in the Garden of Eden. How Satan employs lies. How Satan comes with flattery, and how all of that is Satan's deception. Truth. God clearly said to Adam and Eve, you shall not eat fruit from that tree. It is forbidden for you. And that the day that you eat of it, the very time that you eat of it, you will surely die. And Satan comes and he says, you shall not surely die. It's a lie. Satan used flattery, did he not, with Eve? Eat of the fruit. Go on. You shall be like God. Friends, Satan's tactics remain the same. You know why? Because they most often work. Why change a tactic that works? And we look at this scene in Daniel chapter 6, we see Satan's dirty paws all over it. Myths are all over this. Lies, flattery, deceit. Satan hated Daniel. Hated him. It's like Satan roamed about that palace in Babylon seeking whom he may devour, and he would devour Daniel. And friends, Satan's lies, flattery and deceit have the same end in view today. He's still a murderer. He's been that since the beginning. And he wants our destruction. Yori, Peter says, the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Satan is out to deceive me. And he is out to deceive you. Every one of you. That's what he's out to do. He lies. Sometimes he just comes quietly and he whispers in the ear of someone. And he says, go on. Keep pursuing your sin. It's okay. Keep rebelling. It's all right, really. Live in sin. That's cool. I mean, everybody's doing it. Maybe it's a way to have fun and excitement. He's a murderer. He's not after your best interest. He wants your destruction. That's his plan. In particular, in this story, Satan wanted to stop the godly man Daniel from praying. Isn't that obvious? He's still the same today, you know. He will try and put obstacles and distractions in your way every day. Just so long as you don't pray as a Christian privately. He hates you praying. He doesn't want it. He wants Christians to stop praying in their families. He doesn't want prayer in Christian families. The last thing he wants to see Christians do is being committed to praying together. He trembles when the church prays. So he'll come with all manner of lies and deceit. He'll place dozens of different types of distract, turn God's people away from prayer. No private prayer, no family prayer, no corporate prayer. That's what Satan wants when it comes to you and me in relation to prayer. None of it. He wants to destroy your prayer life. He wants to ensure that no Christian is truly committed to prayer, praying with other people, praying with their family, and doing it in the context of the church. He'll throw up all excuses in our minds, and we know them. We know them all. And we're probably all... Oh, I'm too tired to pray at the moment. I'll do it later. I'm too busy at the moment to pray. I'll do it later. I mean, my children, I have to care for my children. I mean, my children are too young. There's this thing that needs to be done. He hates prayer. And friends, I would suggest to you from this passage that we actually see another thing here that Satan doesn't want. And that is godly men leading a country. I submit to you, he hates that. He's happy when a godly man is removed from that position of influence and leadership. He'll do all that's within his limited power that God gives him to ensure that blameless men are not prime ministers in a country. That's what he's on about here as well in this passage, and about it today. We don't go over into the corner and feel defeated and think, oh no, it's all lost, we've had it. We don't do that. Actually, we thank our sovereign Lord that Satan is not in control. Put it this way. The roaring lion is on a chain. Jude tells us all the evil spirits have been enchained. He's on a chain, that lion. Is it not John Bunyan in his Pilgrim's Progress that shows us those lions? The fearful Christians didn't see the chain away. Those who had faith knew. Those lions wanted to get them as they walked down that path where that beam was to get to the house. But the lions couldn't get them. They were on a chain. Satan can only do as much as God permits. And yet the fact is that God has given him like a bit of slack on that chain. He wanted Daniel's destruction. He wants ours. Let's consider now how Daniel responds when he gets word of what's been going on with his work colleagues. Daniel's vision. Verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home. In his upper room with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since his early days. When Daniel learned that the decree had been signed, he had a decision to make. Would he pray or not pray? In essence, it's a fairly simple decision. In one sense, it was a simple decision. That was the decision. If he prays, he'll die. If he ceases to pray, he'll lose his integrity and testimony. He has to make a decision. Now let's bring that decision a little bit closer to home. if the Australian government, the federal government, passed a legislation that outlawed prayer, if they passed that legislation, they just did it last Friday, let's just say that happened. And that legislation outlawed prayer, no Christian prayer, no prayer anywhere in this land anymore. What would you do as a Christian? Now, you need to understand the consequences if you violate this new legislation, this new law. The punishment for praying would mean that you would be arrested and that you would immediately be transferred to the Dubbo Zoo, where, due to the economic hardship, the lions haven't been fixed. You'd be led into their enclosure and you would become their food. Would you pray? It's a law of the land. Legislation has been signed off by the Senate. It's been passed. It's in force. Do you pray as you normally do? Or would you buckle under the pressure? Would prayer be part of your family? Remember, those lions are very hungry, and you would not last very long once you got inside their enclosure. Would you gather with us this afternoon at 4:15 to pray down God's blessing upon our gospel opportunity? Next Sunday after lunch, would you gather with us in an opportunity of corporate prayer in a very public place, windows open, doors open, people walking, driving past? Would you? Would I? What would be your decision? Well, Daniel had a decision to make. Would he hold off praying for a few weeks and live? Or would he pray and become lion pucker? Well, what's the verse say? Verse 10. Daniel went home. So it's almost like a letdown in the story. Oh, Daniel went home. He just knows what the legislation has just been passed by the Senate there in Babylon, and he went home. What did he do? He did what he'd always done since his earliest day. He opened his window that faced toward his beloved Jerusalem. He got down on his knees and he submitted and he committed his entire life to the God of this world. Now I want you to notice exactly what it says in verse 10. He didn't just petition. No doubt he did that. That would be only normal. But it also says he prayed and gave thanks before God. Wow. He gave thanks in that situation? Yes, he lived what Paul wrote many years later in Philippians chapter 4. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. What did Daniel do? Daniel didn't panic. Daniel didn't lose it. He's always done. He went home and he prayed, unashamed and unperturbed by that legislation. We sang before, did we not? I'm not ashamed to own my Lord or to defend his cause. That was Daniel. 3 times every day, Daniel had prayed. That had been his routine, it says there at the end of the verse, since his earliest days. You see, the godly routines that he had established in his youth stayed with him even as a man in his 80s. Young people, now is the time to establish good and godly routines like praying every day, that they might stay with you by God's grace all your days. When he gets in that room, his window open back there towards him, pouring out his heart before the God he loved and trusted in. Can you imagine what Satan was up to? Could imagine that Satan was in that room as well, coming with a host of temptations flooding into his mind that Daniel would quit praying just for a few weeks. It's all a while, it's 30 days, it's a few weeks. If you're going to pray at all, Daniel, just do it in your heart. No one need to know. Just go low-key with this prayer thing, Daniel, for a while. I mean, let's be reasonable. I mean, what sort of influence will you have in the new empire if you're... Just drop off praying for a bit, hey? I mean, Daniel, you think about it. You've got all these responsibilities anyway. Think of your responsibility and your age. I mean, you're so busy. I mean, couldn't you leave it for the younger men to do? How are you going to fit it in anyway, Daniel, with all this responsibility? You see, Satan the lion sometimes comes like he did in the Garden of Eden. He sometimes comes like a slithering snake. And he comes in a more gentle way. Not so much roaring sometimes, but whispering and subtly giving suggestions. But Daniel refused to bend. At least to Satan. He resisted the devil, and the devil fled from him, because Daniel chose to submit to God. James gives us a wonderful promise in James 4 verse 7. He says, submit to God. Submit to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Daniel's decision to submit to God. Daniel's decision to submit to God, evident in his heart, was a wonderful thing, because it showed us, though he was a normal man, he brought this before God and he left the consequences to the Lord. Did he know what was going to happen? No. He left it with God. Now we know what unfolds in this well-known story, don't we? He gets dobbed in. Do you use that term anymore, children? Get dobbed in? No? Someone was telling on him. Maybe you understand what that means. Someone was telling on him. And the message gets back to the king. Which brings us then, in the third and final place, to Daniel's deliverance. Darius the king, Darius the king realizes that he's been duped. So he sets to work to try and find a legal loophole to get Daniel off the hook. Because he knows well as anybody that the laws of Medes and the Persians could not be revoked. It could not. That legislation was passed. It was permanent. But that didn't stop the king, at least, from trying to find a way to save Daniel's life. Verse 14 tells us that the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself. He realizes that he's been fooled. He's annoyed with himself. And then what does he do? He set his heart on to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. He worked all day to find a loophole to let his beloved Daniel off the hook, but he couldn't find one. So Daniel sent to the lion's den, and Darius goes off to his palace for the night, but he couldn't sleep a wink. Verse 18, the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musician was brought before him, and also his sleep went from him. And then as the sun is like it's about to happen, the dawn is about to happen, he gets up, he rushes to the lion's den to find out how Daniel fared through the night. It says in verse 20, and when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, that's a great testimony, has he been able to deliver you from the lions? And he waits for an answer. Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live ever. Can you imagine the look on the king's face when he heard that familiar voice? Can you imagine the look on the faces of the Persian Mede soldiers standing guard around that den when they hear Daniel's voice? They thought this was a strange night because all night they hadn't heard anything going on. And now they hear Daniel. It's Daniel's deliverance. Now, how did he survive this? How was he able to overcome those fierce lions? We know as the story goes on in verse 24, we know that those lions had been deliberately starved so that when the others are thrown in there, they depart before they even hit the bottom. So the answer is not, well, they were tame lions, they had been hand-fed by the zookeepers, and that's why they were placid that night. No, that's not the answer. These were hungry lions, these were angry lions, these were roaring lions. How did he survive? Well, let's let Daniel answer that question. 22. My God. This is how it happened. It's all about my God. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me. Because I was found innocent before him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. God knew that I was not guilty of these trumped up charges. And what has God done? He sent one of his angels directly from heaven. He's come down into this den, and those mouths of those lions have not opened all night. And then he says, there's other things to say in verse 23 of what he says by way of an answer. How was he delivered? The king was excited for him and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he believed in his God. Interesting description there. It seems that there was a hole in the top of the den. The spectators perhaps could see in to what was happening down below. And it's very possible that was the very hole that King Darius spoke to Daniel at down through at dawn, and they heard Daniel's voice come up through that hole. And it seems that that's the very hole that they brought him up out of, as the verse says, the den. But we see there at the end of verse 23, it's clearly stated for us. No injury whatever was found on him, because here's the reason: he believed in his God. Not one little scratch from a pussycat. Not one scratch on him anywhere, because he believed God. He had faith in God, and that's confirmed for us in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 33, the faith on chapter, which says, through faith they subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, and stopped the mouths of lions. How did he overcome? Through faith in God. And that, friends, is how God's people can face lions and overcome them even today. Through faith in God. It was because Daniel had resolute faith in God, the God who he could trust, that he was able to overcome the lions. Now, as we draw these lessons together this morning, I want to turn you to two passages in the New Testament. I've made reference to them along the way. Firstly, James chapter 4. Verse 7. Therefore submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Verse 10, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he'll lift you up. That summarizes this story. Daniel was willing to submit to God. Daniel drew near to God in the privacy of his room, and God drew near to him in the privacy of the den. It was in the of heart submission to God in prayer that Daniel, and for that matter, that we can resist the devil, the lion of our souls. Daniel, the godly man, humbled himself in the midst of seeming death, and what did God do? God, as he promised, lifted him up. Daniel was literally lifted up out of the lion's den, and Daniel was lifted up again in the kingdom. The last verse of Daniel 6 speaks about how he prospered under Darius and even under Cyrus. Daniel humbled himself in the sight of the Lord, and in God's good time got up. Now turn please to 1 Peter chapter 5, and this is our last passage as we finish. 1 Peter 5. We see more lessons here that wonderfully are summarized for us by Peter in 1 Peter 5, verse 6. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may make you in due time. Casting all your care, all your concerns, all your anxieties, throw them on him. Why? For he cares for you. He cares for you. He really does. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. Daniel humbled himself under God's mighty hand. His 80, if you like, years experience had taught him that he could have confidence in God. He knew he cared for him. It was by casting his cares upon the Lord in the place of prayer, Daniel could remain steadfast, He could be vigilant. He could be firm. Friends, resisting Satan and enemies is only possible when our eyes are firmly fixed on God, when we are steadfast in the faith. We too face lions. Therefore, we must humble ourselves, submit to God in prayer, not shying from praying privately, not shying from prayer with the family or with God's people, but humbling ourselves under the mighty hand of God in prayer, resisting the devil in God's strength and knowing, as he has promised, prove with Daniel in Daniel 6, that he will exalt us as well in his own good time. Though he has given the devil a little slack on that chain, God cares for us. We have many promises. Yes, we live in a hostile world, a world that wants to destroy us, to devour us. We are to engage in a spiritual warfare. That's what we are called to do as Christians. But we can do so with confidence in God because he's promised us in Romans 8, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. We're persuaded, says Paul, that nothing in all creation, no, not even the devil and all of his wicked angels, are able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Yes, the devil is a real enemy. Yes, we war against the flesh and we war against the world. But as Christians, we are more than conquerors in Christ. Daniel teaches us how to overcome lions. Pleased to give us resolute faith in God as we face our lions. Knowing that it's by believing in him, it's by trusting him every day along the way that we too in our generation can overcome the lions. God has called us to fight, and as part of that fight, God has called us to stand. And God has called us to keep our eyes firmly fixed upon him. And part of that armour, as we know in Ephesians 6, is all prayer. May God be pleased to help us be modern day Daniels, overcoming lions in our world.